We are continuing today with our session slides on NURS 336, known as Occupational and Community Health Services. Today we are going to look at Section 7. I may have told you that occupational health services have been divided for the purposes of our studies into 4. The last section we did was on Section 6, and that was on the historical background of occupational health and safety. Today we are looking at, in Section 7, legislation and standards. Dear students, maintaining health and safety at the workplace, I must say, is pivotal. Legislation and standards are available in all workplaces to ensure health and safety at the workplace. The legislation spells out the rights, responsibilities, and principles necessary for achieving and maintaining health and safety. I'm sure you would agree with me that it is very important to maintain health and safety at the workplace. Health and safety legislation sets standards to ensure that health problems and risks at the workplace are reduced to the minimum. Employers as well as employees both have responsibilities for health and safety at the workplace, according to legislation. But employers have the overall responsibility of ensuring health and safety at the workplace, and there are consequences if both parties fail to meet minimum requirements. Dear students, workers have the onus to work safely. It is important that all workers work safely at their workplaces, and they must also cooperate with employers by adhering to workplace health and safety policies as well as procedures. Governments also have a responsibility, students. Governments are expected to inspect workplaces and make sure they enforce legislation. Let's look at our objectives for today. At the end of the session, each student should be able to identify the legislation and standards that apply to workplace health and safety. This is very important, and bear that in mind. Each student should also be able to discuss the importance of legislation regarding health and safety at workplaces. Students should be able to discuss the responsibilities of both employers and employees. I have told you they both have responsibilities. So you should be able to discuss their responsibilities towards workplace health and safety. And finally, each student should be able to discuss the role of government in occupational health and safety. I must say that the key topic to be covered in this session is occupational health and safety, with emphasis, students, on legislation. These are your reading lists. Make sure you read them. Students, health and safety issues are critical in the workplace. Legislation in workplaces outlines the rights, responsibilities, and principles for achieving and maintaining health and safety at the workplace. Legislation also sets standards that serve to reduce health problems and risks at the workplace to the minimum. I must have said earlier that legislation spells out consequences of not meeting the minimum required standards. Employers, as I said, as well as employees, have obligations under health and safety legislation. Employers have the overall responsibility of ensuring health and safety at the workplace, and I'm sure you agree with this. If you have employed people to work, you have to make sure they maintain health and safety standards at the workplace. Workers should also work safely and should adhere to health and safety policies and procedures. Governments, I have said, who are also the standard setters, should inspect and enforce. That is the duty of the government. Legislation ensures that workers are well trained and have the needed competence for the work they do. I believe you agree with me that if workers are not trained and they are not competent to do the work they have to do, problems may arise, accidents may occur. So it is important that the workers are trained and they have the competence they need to have to do the work assigned them. Students, there are laws that deal with hazards, such as noise, chemicals, and biological hazards at the workplace. Some legislation are industry specific. What I mean is various places of work have their own legislation that guide the work they do, while there may be general laws that apply to all workplaces. So there are general laws and specific laws at the workplace. Workers and employers should all be knowledgeable about the legislation for health and safety for their specific workplace. So what we are saying is it is important for workers as well as employers to know the legislation where they work. In some countries, such as Canada, where workers work with hazardous products, I have mentioned a new word, but we will soon learn about the word, and the word is hazard. In countries like Canada, where workers work with hazardous products, precautions are supposed to be maintained, and the following are some of the precautions. Workers are to be informed of the nature of the hazards posed by the products at the workplace. If you work with a hazardous compound, you should know what the products are and the hazards you are supposed or you may come across. You should know. You should be knowledgeable. Hazardous products are also to be labeled. It is important that all products that are hazardous are labeled. In addition, hazardous products must have information sheets that spells out components of the product, its physical properties, health hazards, first aid, toxicity, and other health and safety related information. Now, we've looked at legislation and we are coming to look at one particular legislation, and this is known as the workers' compensation. I'm sure some of you, or if not all, may have heard about the workers' compensation legislation. This legislation was established to protect workers and employers in the event of work-related illness or injury. If somebody should get injured or if somebody should fall ill at the workplace, this legislation is to help protect workers as well as employers. The legislation protects employers from being sued by workers following work-related injury or illness. If this legislation is not in place, workers may sue their employers unduly. So the workers' compensation is a very important legislation at the workplace. When workers become ill due to their work or are injured at work, they receive the workers' compensation so that they do not take legal action against their employers. I believe you understand what we are talking about. Compensation allowances are given to workers who require them when they report the illness or injury and follow the required procedures. If you are injured and you don't report it, you may not get the workers' compensation. And if you don't follow the correct procedures, you may not get the workers' compensation. So it is important that in case one worker falls ill at work or is injured at work, you follow the procedures as required. Now, let us also look at human rights legislation. There are human rights legislation at the workplace, and that is what we want to focus on now. Dear students, human rights legislation are also found in the workplace in relation to occupational health and safety. These human rights legislation protect basic human rights of workers. For instance, human rights legislation protects workers from discrimination at the workplace due to disability, sex, or religion. We all know that sometimes people who are disabled are discriminated against at our workplaces. They are all pushed to do just certain jobs like being in the lift and operating lifts or doing other duties. But some of them are capable of also doing other duties, but they are merely discriminated against, and this is against their human rights. Sometimes a person's religious background or sex contributes or leads to him or her being discriminated against. So there are legislation to guard against all these. Any worker who gets injured at work should be accepted back at the workplace. It is important that a worker who gets injured at work is accepted back at the workplace and is given other duties he or she can no longer perform his or her previous duties. So it is important. This is a form of rehabilitation. If a worker should get injured and he is treated and he returns to work, we must ensure, employers must ensure that he is given other duties he can perform if he cannot perform his or her previous duty. There are other legislation besides the workers' compensation human rights legislation, and these include employment standards, public health legislation including communicable disease reporting or immunization. There are also building standards and codes. There are fire codes and there are disaster services. All these are important to maintain the health and safety of workers at the workplace. There are also standards. Besides laws or legislation at the workplace, standards are also in place for purposes of workers' health and safety. Most or all industry have standards, best practices, or industry safe codes to ensure health and safety at the workplace. Note that these standards are documented for use by employers. Other standards are set by organizations and reflected in their policies and procedures, such as policies regarding personal protective equipment. In summary, students, I am saying that legislation regarding health and safety is important in industry to safeguard workers' health. I have also said that both employers and employees are expected to play their roles to ensure health and safety at the workplace. The workers' compensation is provided for workers who get ill at work or who get injured at work. The workers' compensation helps to prevent workers from suing their employers unduly. There are also human rights legislation and standards in place in industry for health and safety purposes. Thank you.